Now, first of all, to start, we live in a world of uncertainty. Things are changing very, very quickly, and people feel that things are beyond our control. The history of humanity is very, very interesting. And if you look back at history, you see that people generally accepted superstition as reality. And there were just superstitions that were galore. Some of it was idol worship. Some of it was just ideas that they believed in. They still believed in God, but they had some superstitions as well. There's still superstitions today. What's interesting is we're going to see a poll in a minute that belief in astrology amongst US adults has actually risen in the last year. And part of it is due to the COVID pandemic, that because COVID came, people felt as if, since COVID came, people felt as if the bottom fell out from them. And as a result of that, people are looking for comfort. They're looking for some sort of security. So for that reason, we will see, if you look up on the screen, that 18 to 29-year-olds, 32% believe in astrology. Those that are a little older, 30 to 49, it goes up to 34. It drops off after 50, and it drops further down when it's over 65. I'm gonna have to go back to that. So what is it that people believe in astrology, and why is astrology so important to people? So what we're gonna do right now is watch a video on astrology, and it saves me the time of trying to explain everything. I recommend that you watch and listen to the video, because those that are familiar with astrology, it'll only reinforce what you know about it. Those that don't know anything about it, and at least it'll give you something about the zodiac signs, it'll give you about the celestial bodies, and then it'll ask the question, how does Judaism feel about it? So here we go.
What is Judaism's position on astrology? To answer that, a little intro is in order. Astrology is the belief that each celestial item that makes up the furniture of our skies has a direct influence in one way or another on planet Earth and its human population. Now, there's a lot going on up there, but as far as astrology is concerned, we can group it all into two categories. Of all the countless stars, astrologers are fascinated by 12 specific clusters or constellations. If we draw imaginary lines in the sky, like a child drawing dot to dot, these clusters turn into simplified images. Why are these clusters meaningful to astrologers? Because they belong to a region of the sky that is directly in the path that the sun takes during the course of a year. If we imagine the sun to be a giant pointer, it draws attention to a different constellation each month. So nature itself appears to highlight the importance of specific clusters at specific times. Astrology refers to the constellations as zodiac signs, and the region of sky they occupy as the zodiac belt. Beside the stars, which occupy fixed positions, there are also celestial bodies that move through our skies and are said to wield influence. 7 of them are close or bright enough to be visible to the human eye, and were therefore known to the ancients, who treated them as a complete set. Now, the exact positions of the constellations and planets is highly significant to astrology in at least 3 ways. 1. Birth. This is a one-time calculation. The astrological reading at the moment of your birth says a lot about your personality and life. 2. Events. This is a relationship between the stars and planets and large-scale events on planet Earth. Wars, wealth, tsunamis, famines. 3. Activity. This is a way to determine which activities are likely to be successful based on their timing. Certain astrological signs suggest that beginning a specific activity at that time is highly advisable, while to begin other specific actions would be disastrous. So, where does Judaism stand on all this? Well, for a start, Judaism insists that God directs the world. The stars and planets do not. Does that belief sabotage astrology? A look inside Judaism's classic sources reveals conflicting opinions. Some, like the famous Maimonides, insist that the stars and planets are perfect for configuring a precise calendar, but nothing more. Others argue that God created these features of our universe to serve as useful tools. They do have an influence on us to an extent directed by God. Several classic Jewish sources deal with astrology, but today we'll take a look at the Talmud. The Talmudic sages used the Hebrew term mazalot, which means flow or travel, because the planets journey through our skies. And they discussed 3 astrological time periods: hours, days, and months. The monthly mazalot are the zodiac signs that alternate on a monthly basis. But here's a catch. Jewish months are lunar-based and fit a unique Torah system of astronomical calculations. So don't expect the monthly mazalot to perfectly match the common zodiac system. But the monthly zodiacs are very rarely mentioned in the Talmud, so the rabbis couldn't have considered them overly important. Instead, they paid close attention to the hourly mazalot. How do those work? Divide each day into 12 equal hours and each night into another 12. Each hour of the day and night is influenced by another of the big 7. Begin with the first hour of Saturday night. Put Mercury in that slot. For the second hour, add the moon. The third hour belongs to Saturn, then Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, and the 7th hour is Venus. For the 8th hour, begin the pattern again. In goes Mercury. And we keep up the same pattern all week long. It fits perfectly, so we always start again with Mercury at the first hour of Saturday night. Now, in addition to the planets rotating their rule on an hourly basis, there is also the concept of daily mazalot. For this, we must view the day and the night as 2 distinct units of time. We then identify one dominant mazel for the 12 daytime hours, and another dominant mazel for the 12 night hours. Let's take Tuesday as an example. Which planet dominates the first hour of the day? That would be Mars. So Mars is the major player for that entire 12-hour period, while the others are minor players. But when night falls on Tuesday, Mars steps down from its throne. Which planet takes its place? Saturn sits at the first hour of each Tuesday night. So Saturn becomes the primary influencer throughout that night. That's how the daily mazalot works. But as mentioned earlier, the Talmudic sages focused mainly on the hourly mazalot. For example, if you wanted to discover something about your natural personality, you would identify the precise hour of your birth and take note of its dominant mazal, which lends a whole new meaning to our responding to a birth with Mazel Tov.
Okay, so we're going to go through some of the stuff that we saw in the video and put it into Judaism. So I want to just say a few things about, first of all, we have to understand the difference between astronomy and astrology. Astronomy is the study of the stars and the zodiac belt in regards to its movements and its journeys and how to conduct the calendar. You saw in the video before, as we're going to soon see, Maimonides dismisses astrology, but he was a great student of astronomy. And astronomy was very important to him because in Judaism, you need to know the exact precise second of the birth of the new moon in Jerusalem. And all the calculations that Maimonides brings out are from astronomy. Secondly, astrology was very prevalent in the Middle Ages. In fact, there are things that we have today that are based on astrology. Astrology means a star. Aster is a star. Logy is the study of the stars. So I'm going to give you, or horoscope is the idea of an hour and looking at the hour individually. So I'm going to mention, physicians know that you don't just call flu, but it's called influenza. There's influenza A, influenza B. What is the word influenza? Influenza is a Latin word. Where does it come from? It actually comes from a flu that happened in the Middle Ages, but they didn't call it flu. They said that the virus was caused by the influence of the stars. And that's why it's called influenza. So influenza was an exact meaning of how they really looked at the stars, how stars actually influence. Now, what we saw in the video are three things. Number one is natal. Natal is the position of the planets and the signs, the zodiac signs, how they affect birth. So that's the natal. Then you have the general, which is when is a good time to plant, when is it a good time not to plant, when is a good time to start war, when is it a good time not to start war. And we're going to see some examples of how it was actually seen in biblical times. And the third thing is cathartic. Cathartic is the basically if you should start a particular action. So general is just things that happen in the world. Cathartic is how you put it into your own life. So those are the three things. And here is the question, not that you're going to answer, we're going to try to answer it. What do you think Judaism's stance on astrology is and why? So think about that for a moment. Do we know that if there's astrology in Judaism, is there any reference to astrology? I will tell you straight out that in the Torah, in the written Torah, you don't find much reference to astrology. But when you look in the Talmud, when you look at the commentary of the written Torah, you do find reference to astrology. Now, before we go there, we have to establish a fact. One other thing I want to tell you. If you turn to page 46, you will see that the Talmud does actually accept astrology, because you see that there's a whole system there. It shows you the 7 celestial bodies, starting with Mercury, the moon, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the sun, and Venus. And it tells you, as we saw in the video before, the effect that it has on the hours. You also see a chart, which is called Rabbi Hanina's destiny chart, which is mentioned in the Talmud on page 156 of what the influence of all of them are. And then you have the monthly zodiac signs, which the Talmud doesn't talk much about, but there's a reason for that. And if we have time, we will go and explain what they are. But just as an example, the month of Nisan, which is the month of Passover, is Aries, which is a tleh, which is lamb. That's the time when the lambs give birth. Iyar is the Taurus, which is a bull. That's when the bulls are born. Sivan is Umim is twins. That's when the goats are born. Tammuz is Cancer. Cancer looks back. Month of Av is like a lion. That's when the temple was destroyed, and so on and so forth. So we're not going to go through all of them, but there's all these reasonings why they're there. And the question is, before we think about what influence they have on us, do we even find it in the Talmud? Where do we find the Talmud? So we're going to use some examples. Some are written and some I'm going to elaborate by heart. Okay, so let's start with the written one. This is a very interesting story that everybody knows. Hopefully, if you studied any Torah, you know the story of the birth of Moses. The birth of Moses was a very unique birth because his mother had to hide him in the water, right? She hid him in the water. Why did she hide him in the water? Because there was a decree that Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, made. And what was the decree? Let's give a look on page 48, text 1a. This is a verse from the Bible, from the Torah. This is not Talmudic. This is not commentary. This is actually taken right off the text of the Torah scroll. And it says the following. Pharaoh gave an order to all his people. Every boy that is born must be cast in the Nile, but let every girl live. Now, the Torah doesn't explain why. All it says is that all the little boys had to be thrown into the river to be killed. The girls could be let live. And the midwives were trying everything they can to save the little baby boys. And then it tells the story of the birth of Moses, whose mother was Yocheved, his sister was Miriam, and he was born as a preemie, 7 months old. He was put into a basket, almost like a little ark like Noah had, and it was waterproof. And she put him into the river to let him float. And Miriam watched at the banks of the river to see what happened. And of course, we know the rest of the story. Pharaoh's daughter was bathing with her maidens, and she saw this basket. She heard a baby, and she said, it must be one of the Hebrews. And she saved him, and he became the prince in the palace, so famous that there is even a video about him called The Prince, I think it's called. What is it about the story of the Exodus? But it's basically the prince that was born. So that's the story. But why would Pharaoh issue a decree that the boys should be killed? If he wanted to kill Jewish children, why would he only single out the Jewish boys? Why not the girls? And why would he kill them by throwing them in the river? So for that, you have to look in Rashi. Rashi quotes the Medrash. Give a look on page 49, text 1b. Rashi brings down from the Medrash, and he says the following. Pharaoh made his decree on his own people as well. It wasn't just the Jewish kids, it was all the male babies. He did so because on the day Moses was born, his astrologers told him the savior of the Jewish people was born today. But we don't know if this person is a Jew or an Egyptian. We do see, however, that his eventual downfall will be through water. Well, when Pharaoh heard it from the astrologers, what did he do? He made a decree that very day, against all newborn boys, including the Egyptians, that they should be thrown into the river. Yes.
So was it just for that day?
Yes, according to the Medrash, it was just for that day. It wasn't for any other day. It's a very good point. It doesn't go into description, because remember, the written Torah is written as a code. It's not there to tell us stories or narratives, but there is the oral narrative that comes along with it. The oral narrative says, and we will actually going to read it a little later, when there's an analysis of this particular story, so it'll tell you that actually it was only for that day, because that's when they sense that he will be born. Well, what do we see from here? We see from here that the Talmud accepts the fact that there is power in astrology by the very fact that it tells us this story. But I want to give you a few other examples where the Talmud makes references to astrology. Here's one other example. It's not in the book, so you'll have to, it's in the book on student page 50, but I'll tell you which one it is. Okay, if you give a look at the one that says the evil star, 1313 BCE, you see that one? You have it in your book, so I would like to read it, but I'll explain it as well. After 7 plagues devastated Egypt, Pharaoh took Moses' warning of an 8th plague, locusts, seriously. Heeding his courteous plea to let the people go serve their God, Pharaoh asked Moses for his demands. Moses was unequivocal. We will go with our young and our old, our sons and our daughters, with our sheep and our cattle, because we are to celebrate a festival to God. Pharaoh dismissed Moses' demand, saying he would only let the men go. Pharaoh also gave Moses a cryptic warning. He said, see, evil, and he used the word ra'ah, is before you. In Hebrew, it's ru'u, ki ra'ah neget pneichem. Go see that ra'ah, the evil, is going to befall you. But he doesn't explain what the evil is. Rashi again brings down from the commentaries, and he says that the midrashic understanding is that Pharaoh said that I see in my astrological charts that there is an ominous star called Ra'ah, and it's rising to greet you in the desert, and it signifies blood and death. When the Jewish people sinned with the golden calf, and Moshe intervened on behalf of the Jews, he will say that the Egyptians will say that they will befall. And the Jewish people said that the Egyptians said that they were going to die in the desert. What was he making reference to? To that statement from Pharaoh, that Pharaoh will then say, you see, I predicted that they're going to encounter the star Ra'ah and they're going to die. There are many other examples. One is a funny one. If you look at the next one, 833 BCE, Solomon and Pharaoh. This is not the same Pharaoh, but this is a Pharaoh that lived in the time of Solomon. So after in Kings 5, after describing King Solomon's rise to the throne, the extent of his authority and the peace that reigned through his rule. The book of Kings describes his great wisdom. God gave Solomon wisdom, incredible understanding, and breadth of mind like the sand upon the seashore. Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of the Easterners and all the wisdom of Egypt. The Easterners are the ones that had mystical knowledge. So we all know the story about the two mothers with the one baby that was alive and the one baby that wasn't alive. And basically, in order to decide who the mother was, Solomon came and cut the baby in half. The later version is that there were two mothers-in-law that were claiming that this guy is their son-in-law, and the king said, cut them off. And the one that said, cut him into pieces, that was the true mother-in-law. So that's the way the joke evolves. But the truth of the matter is that there was much more wisdom to Solomon. And that is a story that there was one particular tribe that was sending skilled workers to help build a temple. And the king saw, according to astrology, that all these people are going to die that year. So he figured this way he'll be able to fool King Solomon by sending these people that are destined to die, and they won't be able to complete the project. But King Solomon was just as smart, and he also knew the astrology. So what he did was he dressed them in shrouds and sent them back. And he said, you can't afford your own shrouds. So in a sense, he was playing with him about that. So again, the very fact that the Talmud mentions this concept of astrology means to say that astrology is not something that's poo-pooed, it's accepted. But it still leaves us with a question: how does Judaism deal with it? We know that it exists, but how do we deal with it? So the first thing that we want to establish when we talk about theology versus astrology, that we have to clarify something very, very important. That anyone in Judaism that does accept astrology does not ascribe any decision-making power or independence to the stars or to the zodiac symbols. Even the ones that accept that it exists don't see it as an independent being. They see it as an instrument for God, or they don't accept that it even exists. Why is that? Because that's considered to be idol worship. Idol worship is considered to be cardinal sin number one. To believe in anything else that has a power or an independent power, or is a mediator between God and the people, that is considered to be idol worship. In fact, as you will see on the screen, the word akum is the prevalent word that is found in the Talmud when it describes idol worshipers. Akum is an acronym of the words Ovdei Kachavim Umazalot, worshippers of the stars and the celestial bodies. So we understand, as Maimonides explains, that in the early years after Adam and Eve, the generations were trying to ingratiate themselves with God, and they saw all these stars and planets. They had great wisdom, and they realized that if they're so close to God, then God has trusted them, and we should show them honor and then worship them. And the next generation actually began to worship them. And that's how the original idol worship started, was by worshiping the sun, the moon, and Jupiter, and Mars, and Saturn, or whatever planets they knew about. So the correct description of idol worship is an acronym, which is called Akum, and you will find it throughout the Talmud. Now I'm going to say one more thing that's not necessarily politically correct. I don't mean politically correct according to the way it was by the censors. There were times that the Talmud would talk about certain things that apply to Jews and certain things that apply to non-Jews. And the non-Jew was described as a nuchri or a nochri. Nochri means someone that is not Jewish, that is strange to Judaism. And the censors in Eastern Europe felt that it was derogatory to call non-Jews nochri. So they took it out from all the printed literature. So then they switched everything to Akum, that everything is considered to be the worshipers of celestial bodies and stars. And it happens to be that the East European censors did not mind that. So that's why it became prevalent. This is just a little bit of an academic thing that we should know. So this is number one. However, having said that, so let's push that away. There is no power independent power to them, but do they still have something or not? And there's actually a variety of opinions. And as you saw in the video before, he said when it comes to Judaism, there could be conflicting. I don't like the word conflicting so much. I like the word variety of opinions. And some emphasize one and the other one emphasizes the other. And it's all going to clarify in front of us before. One opinion is that the stars do have influence. The heavenly bodies are imbued, but why is that? Because the heavenly bodies are imbued by God with a certain nature. We see this in the Talmud. The Talmud says that someone was born in the hour that Mars, which is the red planet, is prevalent, so they will have bloodletting in them. They would want to go out and kill. And the Talmud says for that reason, let them become a shochet, okay? Or a mohel for that matter. The point of the matter is that the very fact that the Talmud mentions it means that there are those in the Talmud that do agree that the mazalot or the celestial bodies or the zodiac bodies have some sort of influence, but they don't have influence in the sense that they're the ones that do it. It's like fire. Fire doesn't make a decision that it's going to burn. Fire, by its nature, burns whatever it touches, but God imbued within fire that ability that when something catches fire, it burns it and destroys it. There is another opinion that says, actually, they're not anything more than an indicator. What's an indicator? It's like a watch or a clock. Does the clock tell you that the time has to be now? Not necessarily. The clock is only telling you a fact that right now, when you look at the clock and you see that it's 8 o'clock or 8:01, that's just a timepiece, but it's not influencing you whatsoever. It's just telling you what it is. So according to that opinion, that they have very little influence, it's just the stars are aligned in a certain way because they're telling you that God is revealing a certain nature in this world. But this is not so simple. And the reason for that is because theologically in Judaism, we have problems with it. And Maimonides actually spells it out very strongly. The first problem is that we have freedom of choice. What's the problem with freedom of choice? The second one is reward and punishment. And the third one is prophecy. So let's talk about this for a second. Freedom of choice. Freedom of choice is that we believe that the human being is the only creature that has the freedom to choose between right and wrong, between good and evil. Nothing else has that ability to do it. An animal doesn't have that ability. Whatever an animal has is basically whether it's its instinct or its impulse, or you can train it, but you'll train it for a reward. If you want your dog to sit, they expect a reward and then they'll be obedient. But a dog by nature is not necessarily so. The human being, actually, there's a halacha. And it says, if an animal, let's say you have an ox that's going down the street and it gores another ox, and since it wasn't established as a damaging, aggressive animal, so the owner is only liable for half of the damages. If it happens 3 times and he was warned, then he's liable for all the damages. A human being, on the other hand, is different. The human being, we're talking about adults, from the first moment, they are liable. It says, Adamud la'olam. A human is as if they were always warned, because a human has the ability to make a choice. So if you're going to say freedom of choice, how does that jive with the idea that everything is aligned? If you were born, let's say, in Mars or one of the other signs, so your tendency is to do something, you have no control over it. It's no different than someone saying the devil made me do it, the stars made me do it. So why? I have no freedom of choice. And we will see how the Rambam, Maimonides, criticizes it. And the second point that he brings out is, then there's no such thing as reward and punishment. If you're doing it because that's your nature, then why should you be rewarded for it? And if you're violating something, why should you be punished? Because that's your nature. Let's see how Maimonides writes it. It's actually in today's portion that we study the 3 chapters of Rambam. We actually studied it today by divine providence. So page 55, text 2. He says the following: do not entertain the thesis held by foolish people that God decrees at the time of a person's creation whether he or she will be righteous or wicked. If God were to decree that an individual will be righteous or wicked, or that there will be an insurmountable inborn quality that compels a person to a particular path of behavior, way of thinking, attributes, or deeds, as the foolish proponents of astrology imagine, how could he command us, do this and do not do this? Improve your behavior or do not follow after your wickedness. According to their mistaken conception, it has already been decreed or predetermined by the person's insurmountable nature that he or she must act in a certain way. So therefore, this is a bit of a contradiction. You say astrology has an influence on you, and therefore you're doing it, but it's contrary to the theology of Judaism, and that is that there's freedom of choice. The second thing that he brings out is about reward and punishment. He says, and indeed, were this to be true, what room would there be for the entire Torah? By what standard of justice would retribution be administered to the wicked, or reward granted to the righteous? Shall the judge of the entire world not act justly? This is a statement from Abraham, where he was trying to defend the people of Sodom and saying, aren't there any righteous people there? So let's look the way it's actually said on the board. If everything is predetermined, what meaning is there to the Torah's commandments for us, according to Maimonides? Because there's no freedom of choice. Furthermore, reward and punishment. If our destinies are predetermined, what practical weight do our mitzvahs and prayers carry if it's already predetermined? And if it's predetermined, why are you praying to God? It's already predetermined. It's going to be this way. And even if you accept that the stars are merely a clock, but the clock is telling you the time, if I would go and turn back the clock here, it's not going to change the time. The time is still the time. So what does this mean? That the stars are aligned in a certain way and it has an influence on us. You're laughing. Okay. Third thing is prophecy. And prophecy, I want to give a little bit of an introduction. And let me explain. There's very little prophecy that we see today. Prophecy was prevalent in the time of the First Temple. Maimonides has an entire section on that. Prophets were people that were of the highest caliber of behavior. They were very wise, could be men or women, people that were very refined and worked on themselves to devote themselves to the higher being of the divine. And they merited that God would reveal to them certain secrets. Now, the only things that were recorded, according to Maimonides, were those prophecies or prophetic visions that had eternal value. But things that were just for the moment and had no eternal value, they were never even mentioned. We talked a little bit about prophecy last week, that sometimes prophecy can come in a dream, but in a dream, there's a lot of shaft, but prophecy is accurate. But this is one of the principles that God prophesizes. Today, we have very little of prophecy. Today's prophecy is instead wisdom of the Torah. And the Talmud says that from the time that the temple, the first temple was destroyed, most of the prophecy was gone. There are certain great tzaddikim that have prophecy, but they use it in a very limited way, and they usually use it in a form of blessing. But they're not there to prophesize and tell you what stock to invest in or when to take a trip or things of that nature. And as Rambam says in text 3, page 56, it is a fundamental belief in the Jewish faith that God grants prophecy to humans. Now, what is the proof of prophecy? The proof of prophecy, what does the Torah say? How do you know if the prophet is a true prophet or not? The proof is in the pudding. If what the prophet says comes true, you know it's a true prophet. If what the prophet says does not come, or even there's one fact that doesn't come true, you know that the person is a false prophet. And there are many laws about prophecy. So if somebody comes along, and by the way, we don't accept a prophet just by prophecy. A prophet can only come if they're vetted and they're actually appointed by a accepted prophet, just like you have Elijah the prophet that appointed Elisha to be his successor, okay? But prophecy was a truth. Now, if astrology is a fortune teller and is telling you what's going to be because the way the stars are aligned, what need is there for prophecy, right? So why does God need to tell us the future? We look at the stars and we see that everything is there. So here we have what's called a conflict between the conventional idea of what astrology is to the principles of Judaism. And these principles in Judaism, when you call a principle in Judaism, I just want to make you understand what the concept of a principle is. A principle is not just an idea that we accept. A principle is something that is fundamental in Judaism. Just like Maimonides writes out the 13 principles of Judaism, it's called the 13 principles of faith. It says that these 13 principles are the pillars of Judaism. And without these pillars, you don't have Judaism. And one of them is the idea of prophecy. One of them is about the reward and punishment. So when we talk about this as a principle, it puts us into a question with astrology. So now we're going to try to reconcile the belief in astrology and the idea, the questions that Maimonides brought up. Any questions before we go on? Yes. I'm going to look to see there. No. So let me tell you something. This is a bit humorous. The Talmud actually says a little differently. The Talmud says that after the destruction of the first temple, prophecy was eliminated, and it was handed to the fools. Now, why would the Talmud make a statement that it was handed to the fools? Think about that. Can anyone guess?
And
Well, not only that, no one will want to say I'm a prophet if by that they'll be labeled as a fool. So it's sort of like built in when you say that prophecy was given over to the fools and someone comes along and says, I'm a prophet. Well, the Talmud already said it's only given to the fools, so you must be a fool. So if a person does say that he's a prophet, it's sort of proven that he's a prophet. There's a story with the Kotzker Rebbe that he once sent out a letter to all of his followers that anyone that has a beard that goes beneath the belly button is a fool. So one of the people in a faraway community that was, used to come around to him had a very long beard and went all the way down below the belly button. So he was embarrassed to come. So what did he do? He took a match and he burnt his beard, almost burnt his face off. And when he came to visit the Rebbe saw the scars and his whole beard singed. So he says, what happened? He says, didn't you write that anyone that has a beard below the belly button is a fool? So the Rebbe wrote out a second letter and he said, it has been proven that those that have beards below the belly button are fools. So, that really is the concept when you say, so when you have someone that's a tzaddik, that tzaddik is going to, because they don't boast about it and they rarely come out saying I'm a prophet. They never say that I'm a prophet, but they will insist that you do something good. So we say that there is a certain form of prophecy that is there, but I wouldn't say that prophecy was given to the children. Okay, now let's try to reconcile this issue. And by the way, there was a question that was asked in the Middle Ages by one of the great rabbis. His name was Rab Shrira Gaon. We're going to read him just to give you a little understanding of Gaon. The Talmud was composed, the Mishnah was composed of Tanaim. Anyone that took the Booksmart JLI will remember it. And then after the Tanaim, when the Mishnah was closed, the authors of the Gemara were called the Aroim. The Gemara, when it was closed by Rabbi Ashi, the major center of Jewish life was still in Babylon, in Iraq. And the leaders that took over were called the Gaonim. And we know a few of them, like Rabbi Hai Gaon, Rabbi Nissim Gaon. Rabbi Shrira Gaon actually was also someone that lived before them, and he was one of the greatest halachic authorities. And he received a question, and the question is, how do we deal with these astrological signs? Is there any truth to them or not? So he gave an answer. And this answer doesn't tell you if he accepts it or not, but the answer is, even if you accept it, what does it mean? So turn to page 57. And this answer, by the way, forms the core philosophy of tonight's class. Let's give a look. He says, regarding astrological predictions concerning promiscuity, theft, and the like. In other words, people will say, my stars are aligned in such a way that I have a nature to be promiscuous, or I have a nature to be a kleptomaniac, or whatever it should be. So he says the celestial bodies only generate an inclination and desire. So if someone was born at that time, because the stars were there, so it did give them that inclination. Such people feel a strong attraction to theft or promiscuity, but they can restrain themselves and overcome their inclination. This is the key. So he says the following. This is like the standard negative inclination that we all deal with. Sometimes it entices us strongly, but we can overpower it. The celestial bodies can only cause an attraction, in other words, an attraction, increasing the strength of the negative inclination. God has given such people the requisite strength to overpower this inclination. People who must struggle mightily to overcome their negative inclination as a result of astrological circumstances are granted greater reward by God for doing so than people who do not feel so strongly tempted. In summary, all that celestial bodies are able to do is to determine, according to those who believe in their power, is a desire that can be overcome. So what does he say here? This is a novel approach. So he doesn't dismiss the power of the stars. He says, yes, there could be power in the stars. There could be power in the hour that you were born or the month that you were born, that it can affect your character, absolutely, but it's not insurmountable. It's a greater challenge to you, and you can overcome it. And then he says even more, you were given greater powers to overcome that. So I'll share a story with you, which comes to mind. As you know, that in Judaism, the idea of marrying gals is prohibited. It's a biblical prohibition. So there was this guy that wanted to marry out, and he was actually engaged, and he went to rabbis to talk about it, and they all started telling him all the horrible stuff about it, and it didn't impress him. This is on video that he came to, somebody told him to come to the Rebbe, and he came to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe, as soon as he heard it, he said, you know, I'm envious of you. And you could see the astonished look at this man. The Rebbe is envious of me, the Rebbe, the great leader, the great rabbi. How could he be envious of me? So he said, a person is not given a temptation unless they were granted higher powers to overcome that temptation. The fact that you were given that temptation means that you have greater powers than I have. Go use it. And actually, he went down to the synagogue, he cried, and it changed his whole life. So the point of the matter is that it's based on this statement from Rav Shri Gaon. What Rav Shri Gaon is saying is, yes, it does have an influence on us, but it's no more than a strong attraction and a strong interpretation. But you are given the power to overcome that temptation, and you could use it. And not only that, by doing that, you will even have more reward than the person that hasn't done that. Okay? So that answers the question about freedom of choice. So even if we accept astrology and we accept that it has a power on us, depending under which of the planets we were born or what we're connected to, but at the same time, the human being has greater power because of the divine spirit that's within us, the soul, which is a part of God, that can help us overcome it. Now, what about reward and punishment? It sort of answers it, but there's even a greater answer. If astrology predicts something, does it mean that it's a fait accompli, that it is done? So it depends. It depends on certain kind of things that we're soon going to see. There's a fantastic story in the Tractate of Shabbat, which discusses all these issues, and a story with Rabbi Akiva. I'm sure you heard of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was a fantastic, great scholar who became a scholar at the age 40 thanks to his wife, and he became a leader of thousands upon thousands of students. Unfortunately, many of them died. We're not going to go into that right now, but it says that all of the Talmud is based on Rabbi Akiva. So here's the story that the Talmud tells. Give a look at page 59. Rabbi Akiva had a daughter. Astrologers told him that she would be bitten on the snake on her wedding day and die. Rabbi Akiva was very worried about this. Let's stop right here. The fact that Rabbi Akiva was very worried about this, what does that tell you? It tells you that when an astrologist comes and tells you something, it's not necessarily nonsense. There might be some truth to it, and therefore you have to take it serious. So he was worried. He didn't know what to do. On the young lady's wedding day, she took an ornamental pin from her hair and stuck it in a hole in the wall for safekeeping. Actually, it might have been like a chalk wall that she was able to stick it in, so it was there. When she did so, it lodged into the eye of a snake, killing it. This was at night. She didn't see it even. In the morning, when she pulled the pin out of the wall, that snake followed, attached to the pin, which means to say there was a dangerous poisonous snake on the wall that if she would have gone to bed, it would have attacked her. And because she took the pin, stuck it into the wall, she killed it. Okay? So Rabbi Akiva asked his daughter, what did you do to merit this? She told him in the afternoon, a pauper knocked on the door, but everybody was preoccupied with the wedding feast and nobody heard him. I stood up, took my portion of food and gave it to him. Rabbi Akiva said, you performed a mitzvah and you were saved in its merit. Rabbi Akiva went out and taught regarding this incident, charity will save from death. Actually, this is something that we say every Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, but especially in Yom Kippur when we say the Unatana Tokef prayer, when God stands in judgment. So no matter what the judgment is, it says that repentance, return to God, and prayer and tzedakah saves us from the evil decree. That's the exact text. The tzedakah part is taken from this story that Rabbi Akiva recited. That in this case, since his daughter did, there are other cases as well. There's another case in the Gemara where astrologer was standing by the entrance of a forest and there were two rabbis there. And they said, these people were wood choppers. He said, you see these wood choppers, they're going to go in, but they're not going to come out. And in the evening, they came out. And the astrologers said, this can't be. They asked them to put down their chopped wood, their lumber. They opened up the bundles, and there they found a dead snake hacked to death. So the rabbis asked these men, what did you do? They said, nothing. You had to do something. They said, oh, there was some poor people walking down the path, and they had nothing to eat, so we gave them our meals. So again, it was the tzedakah that they gave that they cleared that's what saved them. And Rashi comments on that and says in text 5b, through prayer and meritorious acts, one astrological destiny can be changed. What does this mean here? It means two things. Number one, that there are commentaries like Rashi and the Talmud that say that astrology is real, and the signs that the astrologers see in the heavens are real, and you should take it seriously. However, it's not the final decider. We have a power that is greater. There is a statement in the Talmud that says, Ein mazel liyisrael, that those that follow the way of God, the mazel has no effect on them. The mazel, as we said before, those are the zodiac signs. They're called mazoles, and they have no effect on them. Why? Because they are directly connected to God, so they can override everything. So what's the lesson that we learn from here? The lesson that we learn from here is two things. Number one, yes, there could be an inclination, but the human ability is stronger than that. We can overcome it. And secondly, even if something has been predicted by the stars and the astrologers come and tell you, you still have the power to overcome that. And that is an important statement. Okay. Now we're going to go to prophecy, and then we're going to go further. This prophecy is very, very important, this piece. Let's look at text 6. Everybody okay? Following? No questions? Okay. Astrology's weakness. The Midrash says about the going back to the prophecy in the time of Pharaoh, when the astrologer said that the Savior, and by the way, the Savior is not the same way that the Christians use Savior. The Savior means the one that's going to be the messenger from God to liberate the Jews from bondage and from Egypt. So he says they saw that the Savior of Israel is born today and that he'll be punished by water. So the Midrash says astrologers chirp and do not understand what they're chirping. They mutter and they do not understand what they're muttering. Pharaoh's astrologers saw in the stars that the Savior of the Jewish people would be condemned by water. So they made a decree that all male children should be cast in the Nile. So number one, they didn't know if the child was going to be Jewish or not. They just knew that it was a male. After Moses has been placed in the river by his mother and protected safely in the basket, the astrologers said that the Jewish Savior has already been cast in the water. And therefore Pharaoh revoked the decree. That's where we say that it was only one day. What the astrologers did not know was that the water would condemn Moses with the episode of the water Meribah. Let me explain. So, yeah, Moses was cast in the water, but he was in a waterproof ark basket, sailing away in the water, safe and sound. So their vision wasn't a clear vision. So astrology, even though it can tell something of the future, but it is very murky, it's very nebulous, it's very cloudy, it's not with clarity. There are a lot of facts that are missing. What didn't they know? They didn't know that it was the Mei Meribah. What was the Mei Meribah? The Mei Meribah, the waters of Meribah. So just to refresh your memory, there were two incidents at the time of the desert that Moses was required by God to get water out of a stone. One time out of a rock. The first time God said, hit the rock and the water came out. The second time, which was many years later, and that was when all the people were assembled, God said, speak to the rock and let the rock give out water. And Moses, instead of speaking to the rock, picked up his staff and he hit the rock. There are reasons why he hit the rock. One of the reasons is that he was trying to be kind to the Jewish people, that later when the prophets are going to scream and condemn the Jews when they're in Israel for worshiping idols, they will be able to say, you only spoke to them, and speaking to them, and God will say, I spoke to the rock and it listened, why didn't you listen? So therefore he hit them. God was very upset about it, and God said, for that reason, you're not going to enter, you and your brother Aaron are not going to enter into the land of Israel. And it says, for the waters of Meribah, Meribah is where there was the whole fight, that the Jews wanted water, and Moses had to deliver it to them. So therefore they were denied entry. There are many other reasons as well, but nevertheless, Moses was punished by not going into Israel, and he died at 120 on the other banks of the outer banks of the Jordan, the river Jordan, because of that sin with the water. So again, the astrologers knew that he was going to be punished with water, that his life is going to come and end with water, but they thought he's going to be drowned. So therefore they recommended that all the babies should be drowned. So again, it cannot take the place of prophecy. So that answers the three questions. According to this, it is good. And actually, we have another interesting cute reading. So what is the cute reading? You've all heard the term Mazel Tov. Now, there are many interpretations to Mazel Tov. I will give you one now, and I will give you one later. The reason I'm going to give you one now is for those that believe that there is something about the stars and the Mazalot, that their first reason of Mazel Tov is actually said before the baby is born, not after the baby is born. Let's give a look. Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, who was a very famous scholar who lived in the time of Maimonides, writes the following, page 62, text 7. When a woman is giving birth, the people present at the house at the time should pray for mercy for the mother, that she should have an easy delivery, should be a healthy child, but then that the child should be born under a positive astrological sign. And therefore, they say Mazel Tov. So the Mazel Tov is before that if you're going to be born, don't be born in time of Mars, be born in the time of Jupiter or another one of the positive planets or celestial bodies, so your character should be good. So according to this, there is something there. It doesn't mean that it overrides the human ability to override inclination. It doesn't mean that it can't be changed, but it does mean that it has a lot of power. Now, Maimonides comes along and destroys this whole theory, and that's why there are different opinions. So I want to go back to Maimonides for a minute, and then we're going to try to reconcile between everybody. So this is actually a study in how we analyze a viewpoint in Judaism. Maimonides comes along with an opinion and says this is all babamaises, as they say in Yiddish. It's all nonsense. Please don't accept any of it. We also have to understand in the time that Maimonides lived, philosophers didn't believe in astrology, and he was trying to get Jews to be more intellectual and less superstitious. So give a look in text 8. Maimonides comes along and he says, totally different. And Maimonides respected the philosophers in his day. That's why he wrote the Guide to Perplexed, to counter philosophy. And by the way, just as a little footnote, there were several authors of books on philosophy at the time, because philosophy was the craze. There was a time when religion was the craze, idol worship before that was the craze, then it was religion, and then philosophy came up in the 10th, 11th, and 12th century, and it was attracting a lot of Jews, and philosophy was knocking religion. These great Jewish leaders, who were also philosophers, were showing that there's no contradiction, and actually Judaism embodies philosophy in a great way. So therefore he starts with the statement, all philosophers consider everything the astrologers to say to be false. I know that you may not, but how does he answer what it says in the Talmud? How does he answer what it says in all these commentaries that is astrology? So he says the following, I know that you may search the teachings of the true sages in the Talmud, the Mishnah, I don't know why he says the Mishnah, because the Mishnah has very little of it, and the Midrashim, and you'll find teachings that appear to state that astrological configurations at the time of a person's birth determine certain matters. Don't be bothered by this. One doesn't depart from the settled law in favor of preliminary discussions. What does he mean by that? Okay, you know, if you ever study Talmud, you'll see that in the Talmud, there's all these dialogues going back and forth. So let's say there's a question, and the question is a legal question, and you want to know the answer. So you have one opinion or one school that says it has to be done this way, and then you have another school of thought that says no, it has to be done another way, and each one brings a proof which they try to prove by precedent cases or by interpretations of the verses that they're right. And after pages and pages of discussion, they finally come to the finale, and they say this opinion is right because the question that one side asks the other side is irrefutable, and therefore the halacha, the ruling is like that. So for that reason, when you look in the Code of Jewish Law, the Code of Jewish Law most of the time doesn't bring other opinions, it only brings one opinion. This is the settled law. So once there's a settled, I'm going to give you an example that's very simple. Is it warm in the room? Are we sleepy or we're okay? Okay. There's a very famous argument between the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel about how you're supposed to read the Shema. So it says in the verse, you should read Shema when you get up. It doesn't say when you wake up, when you get up and when you lie down. So the school of Shammai said that the morning Shema has to be read while you stand, and the evening Shema has to be read while you're lying in bed, because it says when you get up and when you lie down. The school of Hillel says, no, that's not what it means. What it means to say is when you stand up is at the time that you usually wake up in the morning. That's what it means when you get up. Actually, in English, get up means to wake up. And he says that's what it means in Hebrew as well. And lying down means at the time when you lie down, but you can read it anyway. You can sit, you can stand, you can lie, it doesn't make a difference. And there's a whole discussion back and forth, because each one is trying to say that you have to do it the right way. And finally, the ruling is according to Hillel. Similarly with Hanukkah. Do you light 8 candles the first night and 7 the second night, or vice versa? Do you light 1 the first night, second night? We all know that the halacha is like Hillel. But nevertheless, even though there's a lot of discussions, we go with the finale. So he says the same thing is here. There could be different opinions whether we accept astrology or not. But the final halacha is that we don't accept it. So this is what he writes. Similarly, one should not reject logical conclusions that have already been conclusively proven and instead latch onto the teachings of an individual sage. In other words, one, that his opinion is not accepted as the final law. It is possible that you're another reason he says it's possible that you're misunderstanding something. There may be hidden meaning to this teaching. What is that about? And actually it's connected to the next one, or maybe it's stated in response to a specific need, a contemporary event. Let me explain that as well, since I have a little bit of time. A lot of the Talmud is written in code, especially the stories of the Talmud. It's called the Agadah. A lot of scholars say, why bother studying it? It's just stories, it's code. But the truth of the matter is there are a lot of secrets that are there. There were 2 dangers that the scholars of the Talmud had that they had to prevent. One was ignoramuses, and the second one were enemies of Israel. Why were the ignoramuses a danger? Because if someone is an ignoramus and they know a little bit, little knowledge is more harmful than no knowledge. Anyone that knows that. Take a medicine. You have a patient that comes into your office, and you start talking about the diagnosis. And then they pull out their iPhone and they start looking at Dr. Google. And they read a few paragraphs. And all of a sudden, they're conversing with you as if they are a trained medical physician that has gone through years and years of medical school and residency and internship and all the other things that a doctor has to go through. It says so clearly in Dr. Google. So what kind of patient would you have? Would you rather have doctors? Would you rather have a patient that's totally ignoramus, is a blank page, and says, okay, doc, I accept what you're saying, I'll challenge you, or someone that has a little bit of knowledge and thinks that with that they can challenge you? We know what the answer is. The same thing was true in Judaism. There were people that were ignoramus, but they thought that they understood what the rabbis were saying, and they built entire pyramids on that. For that reason, there were times that the rabbis basically spoke in code. Not only that, I don't know if you know that, the rabbis had their own script of alphabet that was coded, so that when they would send letters, in the old days, you didn't have the post office. So you would send letters through messengers, and these messengers were very curious to see what the rabbis in Babylonia are writing to the rabbis in Jerusalem, and they would read it, and they wouldn't understand it, or they would publicize it. They wrote it in code, like a tic-tac-toe board with little dots. In school, we used to learn that as children, and we used to write messages to each other in that kind of language. So Maimonides is saying, possibly that's what it was. And then there was the non-Jews that would take concepts of the Talmud and take it out of context. One example, and it's just too good to pass on. There is a discussion, if someone damages someone's item and you can't notice that it was damaged, are you liable or not? And the answer is that you're not liable. You only have to pay because it's above and beyond the law. And I'm not going to go into the reason why. So the non-Jews would come, the enemies of Israel would, so give a look, they have this absurd kind of law, and that is specially meant against the Gentiles, so they can do damage that you don't see, and then they don't have to pay and all of that. So the rabbis had to write in code. So Maimonides says it's very possible that the whole discussion in the section of the Talmud, in the Tractate of Shabbat, was a code, and they had to cover it, and therefore they wrote it in that way. But if you would know what was beneath the code, you would see that it was something else. So what do we see from Maimonides? Sorry. Astrology has no validity whatsoever. Number one, it could reflect the opinion of an individual sage only, but it's not halachic. It may have a hidden non-literal meaning, or it may have been taught for external reasons to protect the integrity of the sages. So that is Maimonides. Furthermore, Maimonides says practicing astrology is forbidden according to Jewish law. And the next reading that we read is Maimonides' opinion only. There are other rabbis that don't agree with him. They have a different interpretation of this particular of this particular violation. Give a look, page 64, text 9. It says in the Talmud, in the Torah, one is not supposed to be a ma'onin or a nochish. A nochish is something else. What is a ma'onin? What is the definition of a fortune telling forbidden by the Torah? This refers to a person who tries to predict auspicious times by the means of astrology, saying that this day will be a good day, this day will be a bad day. It is appropriate to perform a particular task on a certain day, or in this year, this month will not be an opportune for this particular matter. So Maimonides actually goes with the opinion in saying not only is it a foolish waste of time, but it is a prohibition to listen to it. It is a provision to even to take it seriously. And that is Maimonides' opinion. But I have to say, to be honest, not everybody agrees with him. In fact, if you give a look at page 6, and it's not to minimize Maimonides, we don't know why Maimonides was going to that extreme. It is very possible that it's true that in his day, there were people that were attracted to that kind of way of life, and they were disregarding Judaism, and he had to go to the other extreme to pull them back. But the fact of the matter is that there are many other great sages that did put trust in astrology. And if you give a look at page 66, it's very interesting what they have here. They actually have copies of original manuscripts written by these great sages where they talk about astrology. But of course, not in the sense of astrology that it's a dictator, because they all believe, like Rabbi Shri Goin, that you can override it, or that you can override it through good deeds or through your power. But nevertheless, there is something to it. So comes the Ramban. Who is Ramban? Remember, there's the Rambam and the Ramban. Rambam was Maimonides, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. He lived before Ramban. Ramban was Nachmanides, even though they both lived in Spain. Ramban was a great defender of Rambam, but sometimes he disagreed with him as well. And he did it in a very gentle way. Nachmanides is known for his great philosophy. He was also a physician. His writings are still studied. He was an unbelievable defender of Judaism. He was a great intellect. He was one of the greatest leaders in the Middle Ages. So he says that there is a verse in the Torah that says, Tamim tiyeh Hashem Elokecha, which means you should be straightforward and pure with God. So how does he translate it? He translated it as the following. Page 68, text 10. The meaning of the verse, be wholehearted with God, is that we should devote our hearts completely to God and trust that he alone controls everything. We should not inquire from astrologers or any other or any future tellers, nor should we trust their predictions will be fulfilled. If we hear any predictions from them, we should assert that everything is in the hands of God, because he is omnipotent and can change constellations, the constellations of the heavens at will, negating all the predictions made by astrologers. We should believe that all future occurrences are determined by our service to God. Okay, what does he mean with that? He says, yeah, there might be some truth to astrology. I'm not going to deny the fact that the Talmud says it. So he doesn't take a stand like Maimonides that just dismisses it and says, we don't understand, it's a code. He says, no, it could be that it's true. But we have a greater truism. And the greater truism is that we have a connection that is even greater than that. And the connection is directly to God. And the connection to God is much more meaningful. So, and the second thing that he says is that even though there might be some there's value in astrology, but it's not totally accurate, and therefore it's not reliable. God is totally worthy of our faith. Okay, so what is Nachmanides saying? He's not dismissing it entirely, and that explains. That also explains why there were so many rabbis that did listen to astrology. They didn't dismiss it out of hand, but they said that there's something which is greater than that. For that reason, you give a look in the Code of Jewish Law, written by Rabbi Joseph Caro, text 11 and 69. So he says, we do not make inquiries from astrologers. You have to understand the Code of Jewish Law was written in a very precise way. When the Code of Jewish Law says that it's prohibited, or in the Yiddish verboten, that it's prohibited to do so, it writes, Osur lases. You're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to do that. Over here, it doesn't say you're not permitted to do it. All it says is, do not make inquiries. What does this mean? This means that if an astrologer does come and tell you something, it may be that it's true. Just like Rabbi Akiva was worried about his daughter. So he wasn't going to go and consult with the astrologers. That everybody agrees you're not allowed to do. Code of Jewish law says it's prohibited. But if an astrologer offers up some advice to you, it may be something that you should take in advance. Now, not everybody agrees to that. I will soon see this. Give a look in text 12. Rabbi Yehuda ben Asher, known as the Riva, writes, if we have firm faith in God regarding everything we do, we will transform the astrological destiny from bad to good. There are some rabbis that are of the opinion, actually, that when you believe in astrology, it has an effect on you. But if you believe in God, it has no effect on you. In other words, we're going to study about the evil eye next week, because the evil eye is also a very big issue with superstition. That's why people have the red string and they have this, or they say canine horror. I remember my father had a particular illness that wasn't getting better. And somebody said it must be the evil eye. So go to someone that knows how to ward off an evil eye. So he went to Rabbi Dworkin, this venerable rabbi. And Rabbi Dworkin laughed and he said, the evil eye only has an effect on those people that believe in it. This is also the school of thought in regards to astrology. There is a very famous midrash on the book of Lamentations that there's a verse that says, you, God, is my lot. And the midrash says that there was once a king that came with a lot of generals and officers, and he conquered a country. He happened to be that it was a good king. It could be the king before was miserable. So people were lining up with the different officers asking for favors. And there was one smart person there who said, everybody wants to engage with the officers. I will go and engage with the king, because the king is the master of everybody. So the Rebbe asked the question, why is that person considered to be someone that's smart? Anyone will know that if you have a choice of going to an officer or to the king, you'll go to the king. He says, because people believe that God has removed himself from the world and he's allowed the stars and the constellations to rule everything. So therefore they pray to the stars, and therefore they pray to the constellations, or they look to it to give them advice. So they have crystals, or they have all other kinds of amulets that they use that becomes the conduit for them. The smart one knows that none of them have real power. The only power is the power of God. So therefore you go straight to God. And that is the meaning of that. That if one surrenders to the lower powers, they might be affected by it. But if somebody has faith in God and observes the mitzvahs, the natural destinies have no effect on them whatsoever. Now, we have just another few quick readings and then we'll be finished, but this is actually very, very important. Somebody wrote to the Rebbe and said, I want to know what your attitude is about horoscopes. Now, most people today, when they read horoscopes, they're just doing it for entertainment. But this man was serious. Do I have to pay attention to it? So the Rebbe responded to him following. Page 71, text 13. I duly received your letter, which you ask about the Jewish attitude to horoscopes, etc. Generally, astrology and the like play no part in Jewish life. It is also written in the Holy Scriptures that the signs in heaven you shall have no fear. On the contrary, we have the commandment that shall be wholehearted with God your God, which is also quoted in the Shulchan Aruch. So in other words, he takes the viewpoint of Nachmanides. Be wholehearted with God, don't pay attention to it. It doesn't play a role in Jewish life. It may play a role somewhere else, but not in your life as someone that wants to live a good Jewish life. This means that the Jew has to have complete and wholehearted faith in God and his benevolent providence, which extends to each and every one individually. As for taking an interest in horoscope, etc., purely as a curiosity and the like, as you mentioned, this would amount to a waste of interest, which should be channeled in a more productive way. For it is explained in Hasidic thought that God has not given man an excess of capacities, nor a deficiency of it. In other words, every person, and especially Jews, has been given a certain amount of capacities and power of concentration, etc., all of which must be utilized in the fulfillment of his purpose in life on earth, namely to live in accordance with the Torah mitzvot and to disseminate justice and righteousness. It follows from the above that if a person should divert any of his capacities, thoughts, and concentrations on useless things, even if it's harmless, it's nevertheless harmful in the sense that he would thereby create a deficiency in the area which is important and necessary for him. Now, there's two parts to here. Part number one, it's a distraction of who we are. We believe in God. Secondly, I never believe that everybody has to be focused. So even if you take a vacation, or even if you go to sleep, or you do other activities, it's for the purpose of gaining strength and to have the ability to do what you have to do in life. Sometimes you have to relax and watch a movie in order to be able to have the strength for the next day. But if you're just engaging in frivolous stuff just for no reason, by the Rebbe, that was sinful, because you have a certain amount of speech that God gave you. You have a certain amount of brain capacity that God gave you. You have a certain amount of energy that God gave you, and you have to utilize it. And the Rebbe personified that. You never saw by the Rebbe an empty moment. It never occurred. The Rebbe never even took a vacation. But that was on a different level. He worked 18 hours a day. But at least he's sharing this concept here. So now the final question is, how does this relate to us today? I'm going to read something very interesting from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. It's true that astrology today is only a form of entertainment. But there are scientists today and sociologists and psychologists that believe that there's no such thing as freedom of choice. Everything is predetermined. We will see how Jonathan Sachs writes that. He says it could be genes, it could be psychology, it could be social circumstances that determine the future behavior of human beings. Let's see. So it's not necessarily astrology. So they have sort of substituted for astrology, they have substituted genes or psychology or circumstances. Let's give a look how he says it. Text 14 and page 72. Free will is one of the fundamental beliefs in Judaism. Maimonides explains why, if we had no free will, there would be, and as he says, no point to the commands and prohibitions, since we would behave as we were predestined to, regardless of what the law is. Nor would there be any justice and reward and punishment, since neither the righteous nor the wrongdoer is free to do any other than what they are. So the problem is an ancient one, but it's become much more salient in modern times because of the sheer accumulation of challenges to the belief in human freedom. Marx said history is formed by the play of economic forces. Freud argued that we are what we are because of the unconscious drives. Neo-Darwinism say that however we rationalize our behavior, we do what we do because people who behave this way in the past survived to hand on their genes to future generations. Most recently, neuroscientists have shown using functional MRI scans that in some cases, our brain registers a decision up to 7 seconds before we are consciously aware of it. And what is Jonathan Sachs doing here? He's lamenting it. And he's saying, don't think that we're so far away from those fools that believed in astrology in the past. And they believe that everything is predetermined. It's happening today as well. And it goes against the grain of Judaism. And he actually takes what Maimonides says and magnifies it, not what Maimonides says about astrology, but what Maimonides speaks about human responsibility, that humans have the ability to be in charge of their destiny. And no matter what inclination they were born with, they not only have the ability, but because they have that inclination, they have a greater ability than another person. There's a very famous commentary on the Torah by the name of the Pri Megadim. And every halakhic authority studies him. Now, the history is that he had a head made out of wood. The old terminology was that if you had a head made of iron, eisen a cup, an iron head means you were able to absorb so much. A wooden head meant that you were a klutz. And a klutz in Judaism was not necessarily a positive statement. But this Pri Megadim was like that. And it took him days and weeks to process knowledge more than his classmates. But yet he devoted his life to Torah study. And through his hard work, he developed a formula of understanding halacha that today no authority in Judaism would give a decisive verdict on law without studying him. And that's the power that he overcame his inclination. This is not the end. The end is actually even more exciting than anything else. And it's actually seen in two drawings. If you look at the board, basically what we're saying is astrology still has power, and they're our puppeteers. But we can overcome it because of our direction to God. Hasidus comes along and says, you got it all wrong. We are in control of the stars and everything else because we are the ultimate. God created the world for us. Give a look the way the previous Rebbe writes it. He said this when he came to the United States in 1943. Text 15. Hasidic elders related that when Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi returned from his studies with Rabbi Dov Ber Demagnev Mizrich, he expounded on the passage, know which is above you. That's in a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. It says, know what's above you, so be careful because God is looking at everything that you do. And he interpreted to me, know that which is above depends on you. And he explains, the spiritual worlds, the highest worlds in the celestial spheres where the angels are and even above that, wait to hear a Jew discussing a matter of Torah. The angels in heaven are waiting to answer Baruch Hu or Kedusha or Amen. The earth that we step on has been waiting since creation for someone to walk in it and recite a chapter of Psalms or discuss a Torah matter with a colleague. So put it into the right perspective. Hasidus says that the entire world was created for the human to be able to make the world a dwelling place for God, which means to say the sun and the moon and the stars, and even the angels, and even the higher worlds, the world of creation, the world of emanation, and the worlds that are beyond it, were all created for our sake. If not for the fact that God wanted us, that wouldn't have been in existence. So therefore, rather than think that they control us, we control them. And not only that, the higher celestial beings say that the only way that they have elevation, the only way that they have fulfillment, that they can become closer to God is through us. The previous Rebbe says that, in the olden days, they had the cobblestone walkways, that when you come up to heaven, the cobblestones will be waiting for you in heaven and saying, Bulach that you are, who gave you the permission to tread on me? Are you a donkey? If you were reciting words of Torah, or you were going for the sake of a mitzvah, or you were thinking positive thoughts, then I was elevated through you. But if not, who gave you the permission to step on me? The piece of steak that you ate, or if you're a vegetarian, the tofu burger that you ate is going to come up to heaven and say, who gave you the right to consume me? If not for the fact that you're using my energy that I gave you to be able to serve Hashem. And the same thing is going to be with the sun. The sun says, I gave you a beautiful sun with a Carolina blue sky. How did you utilize the day? Did you utilize it on a spiritual way or not? So according to Hasidus, the whole discussion is just the opposite. We are not impressed with the astrological stars. The stars are impressed with us. And it actually puts the responsibility in us. Doesn't mean that the stars are not like the clock telling us what the time is like. And it's not like the opinion that they have some sort of influence, but we have much greater influence. And we're the real players. And for that reason, it says that the human is considered to be the choice creation. The Talmud says that every human being has to say, for my sake, the world was created. What does it mean for my sake? It doesn't mean that that's why I take all the spoils and use it, but that I was given the task of making this world a divine garden for God. That is what Tikkun Olam means, to make this world a spiritual place for the divine where you can recognize godliness. And that stands much higher than any of the stars or any of the constellations or astrology. So when you come and you look at Judaism and you look at all of these things that are going on in the world, it doesn't mean anything. That's why, in fact, Maimonides is very opposed to people that use the mezuzah as a charm, as a lucky charm. The mezuzah is a mitzvah. The mezuzah is a conduit of bringing holiness to the home, but it's not a lucky charm. So we have to remember that the mitzvah is the ultimate goal of being able to transform this world. And if we see it that way, then we're utilizing the stars, utilizing the sun by allowing them to fulfill their obligation. Thank you very much. And please, if you have questions, ask, email me. And next week, we're going to discuss the evil eye. The fourth week, we're going to discuss ghosts, demons, and angels. They left the dessert for the last. Thank you very much. Anyone that wants to daven Ma'ariv, we're going to have a minyan right now in the shul for Ma'ariv. Thank you. Thank you all for participating on Zoom.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks. Let me just shut this 1 second. Ooh.
Lesson 2. Stars.
Just trying to end it.